Shout out to Steven and Osbers Gaming for supporting me level 3 or higher on Patreon. Hey everyone, I'm Albert Boris. So, Mario Kart DS. Yeah, this was never really one of my favorite Mario Kart games. Despite growing up with it and playing a lot of it in my childhood, it never really stuck with me, like say Mario Kart Wii or Double Dash did. That's not to say it was bad, however. From the new mission mode, numerous fun nitro tracks, as well as the best battle mode in the entire series, it's still a wildly enjoyable game in its own right. What's not enjoyable, however, are the retro tracks.
No, 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 no.
Yeah, they're kind of awful. Or well, okay, maybe that's a bit unfair to say. Mario Kart DS was the first game in the series to introduce retro tracks. At least in the way that we all know and love them. So I definitely respect this game for it. Does that mean it holds up though? Well, if you don't mind the fact that there are 5 circuits, with one of them being the game's final track, then sure. Even with the limitations that naturally held back a lot of these tracks, there were just a whole lot of odd choices. Like, what happened to the Shell Cup? And why do all the cups have to be chronologically ordered? Just because Mario Kart Double Dash was the newest game in the franchise, it does not mean that Baby Park should be at the end of its cup. Like, that's way too underwhelming. But instead of just complaining, how about I do something about it myself? Today, as the video title implies, I wanted to re-envision how I would have handled the retro tracks myself. What courses would I have picked if I was in charge? And what changes would I bring to them? Of course, remember that this is just my opinion, and what I deem to be fixed is highly subjective. You may have some even better ideas on how to fix the selection, or better yet, maybe you already like it as it is now. That's fine. But hopefully, you'll enjoy this video of my changes to Mario Kart DS's retro tracks as well. So, with all of that being said, I say, let's get started. First, we have the Shell Cup, and this look, I'm not even gonna sugarcoat this, but the Shell Cup of Mario Kart DS is probably one of the worst Mario Kart Cups of all time. Either that or the SNES Flower Cup, but at least that one tries to be normal. What makes this one so awful? Well, I'll tell you what. 3 of the 4 tracks are just the opening circuits from the respective games. The only exception is N64's Moo Moo Farm, and even then it's super simple as well. What were they thinking? Is this how you do a first impression on retro tracks? By boring me to death? So you know what, let's get to work. I think SNES Mario Circuit 1 can stay in the first slot. It was the first Mario Kart track in the very first Mario Kart game, so I think it's at least poetic to also let it be the first retro track ever. It's simple, but it acts as a decent tutorial for how Mario Kart tracks work. No changes here. Likewise, N64 Moo Moo Farm is fine as the second track as well. It was in the second slot in Mario Kart 64's Mushroom Cup, so again, it makes sense. And while it's pretty simple, being just an oval with occasional multi-moles, it feels like a natural follow-up to Mario Circuit 1, with its slightly more unique theme. Now, the third track on the other hand, should not be GBA Peach Circuit. Like, I'm sorry, but this shouldn't even be in the game at all, much less the third slot in a cup. Never mind that we already have a starter track in this cup, but there's basically nothing about it that stands out, besides the oversaturated castle in the backdrop. Otherwise, it's about the most generic course you could think of. So instead, I propose that the third track should have been Riverside Park. Riverside Park was, get this, the third track of its Mushroom Cup. So again, it sorta rhymes. And while the theme isn't too unique, the jungle setting is at least not as basic. It's twistier than the previous 2 tracks, while still being generally easy. Couple in the big jump at the end, and I think this would be a much better third track than this thing. Seriously, Mario Kart Tour did Peach Circuit so much better. Now, for the final track of the Shell Cup, this choice might come off as slightly controversial, but at the same time, there's also just not a whole lot to pick from here. On one hand, GC and Luigi Circuit is a much better inclusion than GBA Peach Circuit, since it's actually kinda unique, but even so, it's still pretty underwhelming as the final track of a cup. So instead, for the 4th slot, I'm gonna choose Dry Dry Desert. Because, get it, it was the 4th track of its Mushroom Cup. It's like poetry, it sort of rhymes. Okay, that's not the only reason, but yeah. Now yes, on one side, I do think it would be incredibly beautiful if the first retro cup in the series had its tracks correspond to their respective placements in their original game's Mushroom Cups. Just because, well, it would be cool. But even disregarding that, I'm not sure what our GameCube track would fit here. Baby Park? And sure, Dry Desert would no doubt suffer a lot from limitations, since I doubt neither the Tornado or Quicksand Piranha Plant would be able to make it. But atmospherically, it would also mark a strong contrast with the other more welcoming Shell Cup tracks, with its more hostile and dangerous theme, as well as slightly more difficult hazards. This way, the Shell Cup never feels repetitive, which was one of the biggest issues with the original one. And speaking of, that wraps up Mario Kart DS's first Retro Cup. Is it good? Well, maybe not. I suppose this would still be pretty average in the grand scheme. Is it better than what we initially had though? I think so at least. Next, we move on to the Banana Cup. This one isn't quite as awful as the Shell Cup, so perhaps it won't be needing as many adjustments, but even so, there's quite a few issues that need to be addressed. First, get out, Baby Park. Seriously, this was like the worst course they could have picked to return, along with Peach Circuit. The only reason it worked in Double Dash was because of how chaotic its item system was. Put that on a weaker hardware, and well, it's just an oval. And it was the final track? Yeah, how about an actually good Double Dash track instead, which I believe this time could start off the cup instead. Luigi Circuit. As I already said, while this would have been rather underwhelming to cap off the Shell Cup with, as the start of the Banana Cup, I think it could actually be decent. It may be a starter track in its own game, but it's actually kinda unique in its own right, with the interconnected roads and all. Every retro selection can have at least 2 circuits in my opinion, and this can serve as the harder counterpart to Mario Circuit 1 for a slightly later cup. Just make the road more narrow, and we're good to go. Next up, for the second track, let's do a SNES course, although maybe not Donut Plains 1. That's just a bit too basic for a Banana Cup, seeing as it was the second track overall in Super Mario Kart. I definitely don't mind having the Donut Plains theme in the game, even if it doesn't look very pretty, but the first one is just too mundane and too easy to be this late. So instead, how about Donut Plains 2? It's pretty similar, with lots of mountain molds and slippery dirt, except for a section where you can also fall into the water, and for that reason, I think it would be much more appropriate for this cup. Frappe Snowland, on the other hand, was a track perhaps a bit too difficult for the Banana Cup. On one hand, it's probably one of the best made retro courses in the game, and in my opinion, possibly my favorite. So I'm definitely gonna keep it. But should it really be before Choco Mountain? Like yeah, I know it was a slot earlier in Mario Kart 64, but with Mario Kart DS's more responsive controls, Choco Mountain is definitely the easier track of the two. It doesn't have ice physics, and the falling boulders are a much easier hazard to avoid than the snowman. So yeah, Choco Mountain for Banana Free instead. Lastly, for the final track, I'm once again gonna keep a pre-existing course, this time GBA Bowser Castle 2. Now yes, I absolutely detest this remake, from the butchered music and ugly skybox, but at the same time, I feel that we gotta have at least one retro Bowser Castle, and besides all the other choices, this one still feels the most harmless. N64 Bowser Castle would no doubt fall victim to the DS's limitations, with the tombs moving around, and GCN Bowser Castle is already pretty similar to the Nitro Bowser Castle in this game, as far as aesthetics go. In the end, this one's just the safest choice to pick, so I can see why they went for it. And as the final track, it would let people know that from now on, things are gonna get harder and more intense. And with that, we have the new Banana Cup finished. Again, not the best cup ever, but I think this one at least flows a bit more naturally. Although, that's a low bar to cross. Now, we move on to the Leaf Cup. Now this one, unlike the Shell and Banana Cups, I think was always pretty good, even initially. Besides Mushroom Bridge for some reason being at the very end, and also with far less elements than the original, the other 3 tracks are at least somewhat reasonable. And just like that, I'm gonna keep the first track the exact same as it is, with SNES Koopa Beach 2. Easily the best of the SNES remakes in this game. The animated water makes it feel much more alive compared to something like Donut Plains, and the layout is pretty nice too, with all the deep water pits you have to avoid. It's not super difficult, but it can be a slight challenge, fitting as the first track of the Leaf Cup. So, what should we pick for the second track then, now that I moved out Choco Mountain? Mushroom Bridge. I know I just insulted it like 30 seconds ago, but keep in mind that when I say I'm fixing these cups, it's not just about swapping out tracks for different ones, it's also improving the pre-existing ones if possible, and Mushroom Bridge definitely can be better in this game. What they did to this course initially was absolutely horrible, and you can't even blame limitations on this. There's no excuse for blocking off the sidewalks and bridge railings. And honestly, even the pipe shortcut should have been possible, because we already know they were able to get it to work for Pipe Plaza. But that's why I'm giving Bridge a second chance, this time as Leaf 2. Because in its full glory, it's actually a kind of interesting map, despite the simple shape, with lots of neat split paths and cars to avoid. And now, for the third slot, let's give in to Frappe Snowland from Mario Kart 64. As said already, this is probably my favorite retro track in Mario Kart DS. The lonely music, dark evening skis, and flat terrain always made for one of the most solitary feeling tracks. And I think that atmosphere would suit very well for Leaf 3. It's almost like a calm before a storm, especially with the light snowfall, so it keeps you on your toes for what's to come next. And when it comes to difficulty, well, I rest my case. But speaking of which, the storm. What should the final track be? Well, believe it or not, but I'm not gonna include GBA Luigi Circuit. I know I said it was a reasonable choice in the original Leaf Cup, never mind that it's probably the most distinct circuit track in the game, but like, it's still a circuit. Technically, it's supposed to be on an airfield, but it's also just a background detail, so it would just be kinda repetitive. Instead, for the Leaf Cup's finale, I'm gonna go for Sunset Wilds. So this is definitely one of the most unique tracks in the series. To this day, there's not a single other course with a similar feature, where the first lap starts off at daytime and then as the race goes on, it slowly becomes night by the end of it. It's such a cool gimmick, which on the surface might be a bit too much for a system like the DS to handle. But then you realize it worked just fine on mobile as well as the much weaker Game Boy Advance. So like, is it really unlikely? And yeah, sure, it didn't work on the Switch, but I think that's more of a problem with Mario Kart 8 Deluxe's particular lighting system. I mean, geez, if you're gonna add a new track with a very specific gimmick to a 7-year-old game that wasn't made with it in mind to begin with, of course there's gonna be problems. If Sunset Wilds was always planned for the game, they'd probably accommodate the lighting system to make it work as intended, something I'm taking into consideration for this. I guess the limitations would still affect the Shy Guys, since I don't think they'd latch onto your carts. But that was only to make you lose coins anyways, a currency which doesn't exist in this game, so they can just walk around for all I care. All in all, what we'd be left with would, in my opinion, still be an epic finale, where you race on the American frontier until the break of dawn, keeping you excited for the last cup. But honestly, even without the sun setting, I still think it could be a pretty beautiful track, assuming they kept the layout intact at least. Because honestly, the nerf to layout was almost just as bad as the sun not setting in the Booster Course Pass. But anyways, with the Leaf Cup out of the way now, that brings us to the final cup in the game, the Lightning Cup. Now this one definitely has its fair share of issues. Although unlike the Shell and Banana Cups, it was this close to being so good. No joke, literally half of it is perfect, but the other half just makes for such an underwhelming finale. Now, in my Mario Kart DS Cup ranking video, I actually briefly touched on the topic of fixing the Lightning Cup. But since it wasn't the main topic of the video, it was just a quick fix. This time, I'll be a bit more serious. Also, fun fact, that segment actually inspired a friend of mine to make his own take on this subject, which promptly inspired me to make this video 2 years later. So anyways, one thing's for sure, Choco Island 2 would not see the light of dawn in my selection. Absolutely disgusting. One of the worst Mario Kart tracks of all time, and somehow it's less bearable in this version. Not enough that it's super ugly and doesn't even look like chocolate, but it's just a frustrating track gameplay wise as well, with the mud everywhere and numerous jump pads that send you off-road. So instead, I propose Vanilla Lake 2 to open up the Lightning Cup. Compared to Choco Island, it's already a much more fitting track atmospherically, with the slightly more cautious soundtrack. And gameplay-wise, it feels like a natural continuation of Koopa Beach 2, with now the even bigger stretches of water you have to avoid. And sure, it would also be kind of annoying, with the ice physics and ice blocks, but I also feel that Mario Kart DS's more responsive controls would make it much more bearable than on the SNES, as opposed to Choco Island with its ramps of doom. Now, for the second track, I'm gonna keep N64 Banshee Boardwalk. This was a very good choice for the Lightning Cup, even in this slot. Since it's the last cup in the game, the tracks have to be a bit more difficult and dangerous, and Banshee Boardwalk perfectly sets the mood as the second track, with its absolutely haunting, but still relatively calm atmosphere. So no changes here, except maybe make the water harder to see. It's a bit less scary as it is now. The third track, I'm also gonna keep the exact same, GBA Sky Garden. My goodness, I can't stress enough how much I love Sky Garden as lightning free. The whole course feels almost like a reward for all of the hard work you've put into the game, with the Heaven theme, an incredibly euphoric soundtrack. And even so, it's still immensely difficult in its own right, taking almost everything you've learned, with twisted turns, ramps, and tons of shortcuts. In many ways, it would even work as the final track overall. However, it still has that feeling that there's something more for you, hence why I'm keeping it here. And the final track was... GCN Yoshi Circuit. Why is Yoshi Circuit the final course? I know I already complained about this a dozen times in this video, but I have to do it again. Why is this the final course of the game? Out of all 62 tracks in the series, you chose to end off the first ever retro selection with a circuit? And yeah, I know Yoshi Circuit is one of the harder ones, since it's in the shape of a Yoshi, but the theme is just like any other one. And besides removing the tunnel, this is another track that didn't really bode well with DS's limitations, since they removed all of the neat references such as the Yoshi copter flying around. You know what should have been the final track instead? 2 words, Wario Colosseum. This would have been the perfect send-off. Wario Colosseum was, up until this point, easily one of the most epic and massive tracks in the series. It was so big that they had to give it only 2 laps instead of the usual 3, and the track itself was basically a huge gauntlet, filled with ramps and huge drops. But here's a fun catch, it's actually kinda simple. You mostly just drive inside this huge cage, and there aren't a lot of hazards at all. Besides the rotating fire bars, it's actually completely empty. Even the audience is non-existent. So actually, this is one of the few tracks that probably wouldn't suffer from any limitations at all, because it didn't have much to begin with. It's just an epic obstacle course, which in my opinion would leave a strong final impression on the first ever retro selection. And now I'm just sad that we didn't get it. But hey, that's just my opinion. How would you fix Mario Kart DS's retro courses? Did you agree with me or not? Or do you perhaps have an even better idea? Let me know in the comments down below how you'd improve Mario Kart DS. And make sure to like, share and subscribe to my channel if you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this. Maybe I'll come around to fixing more games retro selections as well. Let me know what you think. In the meantime, follow me on Twitter, Patreon and join my Discord server, all links in the description. With all that being said, I'm signing off, until next time.